Hello and welcome to Writer's Ramble. I'm Deanna.
And I'm Michael.
And today we're talking about villains, such as villains that we like, villains we don't like, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, types of villains, sympathetic, maybe motivations that we don't like about villains, ones that we do, ones that we think are kind of understandable, even if it's still evil, etc., etc.
I'd first like to say that I feel like for me, when it comes to writing, I actually find it rather difficult to write about villains because whenever I think of evil motives, they automatically, for some reason, it's hard for me to explain, but they automatically feel very cliche to me. And I a simple example, not like a super evil villain that comes to mind, but just an everyday simple villain you might be able to think of. If you envision like a bully in like a high school movie that's like, "Oh, give me your lunch money." It's like, do you not hear how pathetic you sound? You're like a literal cliche bully in a movie. I can't
You're like a
imagine.
literal child.
Yeah, I can't really imagine anyone actually doing that in real life. It's usually other immature behavior, but I never hear anything like, "Oh, give me your lunch money." Like, who has the audacity to say something so stupid?
Um, I feel like I can understand villains a little bit more, but I do really hate it when villain has just the worst motivations. I mean,
I never knew my father.
yeah, that's pretty. That's almost shorthand at this point in writing. It's like, oh, I know the villain. We gotta give him motivation. The bad childhood. Oh, there we go. That it's like putting there's been like an earthquake or something. You put a little band-aid on it. It's like there, fixed it.
I mean, I would say that I think the villain having a tragic backstory, it does explain why they might be messed up, but I definitely wouldn't say it excuses their actions either, but I can understand why it would make them, well, like I said, messed up.
I feel like some of the best villains, you can understand why they're messed up because of their tragic backstory or whatever. But even still, even after you know how they got to that point, um, what they're actually doing, why they're doing it, like if it's to take over the world, as cliche as that is, at the very least give them a solid reason for why they would want that. Because there's people every day, they do crimes, they don't actually try to take over the world. That happens so often in stories, but how often does that happen in real life? You know? Um, it's just not very realistic for your average Joe who, oh no, I was abused as a child, therefore I gotta take it out on the entire world. It's like, yeah, sure, that makes sense.
I mean, well, I mean, I'm majoring in psychology, so we talk a lot about, childhood traumas and stuff. So, I mean, I can understand where a messed up childhood would influence their decisions later in life, and then they would view, everything else negatively and assume that they're kind of excused from their bad behavior. They're excused to make bad choices and treat people terribly. But I guess I usually don't jive well with villains because I feel like I have a mindset where it's like, well, of course, this doesn't condone your actions, but I don't really know what I'm saying anymore.
It doesn't justify them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I do enjoy the sympathetic villains for sure. Like I love the Phantom of the Opera because I feel like if anyone had lived the same life that Eric had, I feel like most anyone would come out well really messed up. So I can understand why he ended up making the choices that he did, but at the same time I definitely don't condone it either. So it's like while I'm a big fan of Phantom of the Opera, what I like most about it is that he at the end had a change of heart and decided to change his ways, which I really respected. But had he just decided to keep, complaining about, his deformity and how the world has treated him as an excuse to, murder people, I of course would not be okay with that. but I appreciated that he did have his change of heart. And so I like sympathetic villains because, they feel more morally gray. You can understand where they're coming from, even if you don't necessarily agree with their actions. But, yeah, I don't know where
Yeah.
I was going with this.
And I got some good examples of sympathetic villains as well. I mean, I would argue that Thanos is pretty sympathetic, even though he's kind of nuts. Um,
I have.
Specifically, Thanos from the MCU, Infinity War slash Endgame. Infinity War more so, I would say, because if you could just like sit back and imagine that you were gonna you're telling everyone the world's gonna end, and it's this huge problem, and literally no one pays you any mind, and then the world ends. You might develop a bit of an ego in a way and be like, "I told you so," and then, uh, he went about going about and destroying half the population of every other planet in the universe to avoid that, which is definitely overcorrection, but like it made sense, and I guess I just thought he was an interesting villain because he wasn't just like, oh, I like killing, so therefore I'm doing this. It's like he didn't even have a personal grudge against any of the Avengers at the very least in Infinity War. He just was like, hey, this is my duty, my sworn duty for whatever reason. He felt that way, and so he's like, I'm just gonna do it, and no one's gonna stop me because it's got to be done. Like he lost a lot of stuff along the way, his own daughter, his little minions, etc., etc. It wasn't a complete and total victory for him, but he did it anyway out of this very misplaced and misguided sense of duty. But like, I almost respect him because he was like very determined to get it done, even though it cost him a lot. Um, I say almost because what he was doing was murdering half of all life in the universe, which is not a good thing, but um, it's an admirable sentiment to be like, I'm gonna do this thing, I'm gonna make sure it gets done, because in my eyes, this is the right thing to do.
Yeah, I feel like of Marvel films, I feel like Infinity War is probably one of my top three favorites, if not favorite. Surprisingly more than Endgame. That's probably hard to explain why I like it more. I think maybe what I liked was that Thanos actually succeeded in his plan, which was like shocking, to
Yeah.
see. But at the same time, he's not my favorite villain either, and I think a lot of it boils down to he has so much power with the Infinity Stones. I was just like, why not just make more planets? I don't know. I feel like that would solve a lot of problems.
I mean, I feel like in that case, you could make a couple of arguments. Like, um, eventually those planets would have the same problem with overpopulation, although technically speaking, there was the same issue with his, but maybe he was just planning on cutting life down again once it got to a crazy number. But also, it's really vague what the Infinity Stones can do. So to claim that they could just make new planets, theoretically, yes, you could do that. You could just make more universe because supposedly the Infinity Stones created the universe in the first place. So you could theoretically make more of it or new planets or whatever, but I don't know if you actually could. It never really specifies, but for the sake of argument, maybe he just that's not within the realm of possibility and what they can do for whatever reason.
I guess I was just distracted by that because when he was going on about, basically committing genocide, I was just like, but maybe you don't, have to. I guess I was so distracted by that I didn't appreciate him very much as a villain because I thought he was being kind of stupid in a way. It's like, okay, well, I feel like the most logical way to fix this is, well, like I mentioned, create more planets or whatever. Because if the Infinity Stones have that much power, I feel like there's another way to fix the problem, and I feel like I was distracted by that, in which I just didn't take him as seriously. Not saying he's like a bad villain, but he was just very for me, just kind of so for me.
um, I feel like this is more so a problem with the Infinity Stones being literal, just MacGuffins, to the point where um, they're really powerful, but they're each different, and we can just kind of make up whatever they can and can't do
Reality
with
can be
every.
whatever I want.
Yeah, we can just make up whatever they do with every new movie. I mean, WandaVision, she
Well,
accidentally.
spoiler alert.
I mean, we technically spoiled Infinity War 2,
Yeah,
but who hasn't seen that movie?
well, that's true, but still, spoiler alert.
Okay, spoiler alert for WandaVision for those of you who haven't watched it yet. In WandaVision, just by uh, pushing Monica Rambeau in and out, I think that was her name, Monica, whatever her name was, in and out of the hex, they called it, um, she just accidentally made a new superpower. She just made a whole world out of her grief mixed with her mind stone powers, and literally made a new vision just out of nothing.
It's white vision.
No, the white vision is the one that was like his old body. The new vision, like I want to call him the sitcom vision because he was the one who existed only in that world. He just was created whole cloth out of like her memory of him. If she can just do all these things, then there's no need to describe in exact detail what the Infinity Stones can and can't do. Basically, because they're MacGuffins, they can't do whatever you don't see them doing, and they magically, at the point at which it becomes relevant in the story, can do anything that they want you to be able to do. Because there's plenty of people who speculate all the time about, like, the Infinity Stones could do this or this or this, and that would completely change things. It's like, yeah, they maybe could, but because of the way it's written, we just have no idea. It's so vague.
Speaking of WandaVision, that's something that I really liked about it, in which technically there was a villain that kind of emerged, or at least we didn't realize that they were a villain until the end.
This is still spoilers, by the way.
Well, of course, yeah. Agatha, you learn that she's kind of like the main villain, but I would argue that the main villain was actually just Wanda's depression, which I liked a lot more because I like it when stories sometimes decide to not focus on a specific person as the villain or the main problem, in the plot. And I like it when there's something else sometimes.
Yeah, the antagonist was almost Wanda herself, and I really wish they had kind of gone all in on that because the addition of Agatha as the quote unquote real antagonist kind of I think cheapened the fact that more or less up to that point it was basically just Wanda's doing, which created a bit of a moral quandary, which I find really interesting in stories, because it's like, is she really that good of a person? I mean, they kind of touched on that a little bit with the director guy being like, she's basically a terrorist, although he was a villain too, so like you can't actually trust his word. I really hate it when shows and movies and stuff um they put they might put their main characters who are good in a morally gray situation, but then kind of because they get like so scared that people are going to like turn on the main character and think that they're actually not good anymore, they'll uh, kind of like edit it in such a way that
It like paints them to look evil.
it'll paint the people who think that the main character is bad as evil, or it'll paint somebody else as more evil so that the contrast shows them as being good. I mean, that's kind of the exact basis of almost any movie that's got like anti-heroes in it. There might be an anti-hero who does things that aren't, necessarily morally right all the time, but then the villains in those are so cartoonishly evil that you can't help but want to root for the anti-hero anyway. It's morality isn't black and white. It's like a spectrum. There's lots of gray in between. And I feel like you can really make something interesting when you let the gray be gray instead of trying to make the gray look more white by making something blacker or, trying to make um, the white look more gray by, I don't know, making something lighter. I guess you could do either, but I feel like oftentimes they chicken out and they say, oh, Wanda wasn't really that bad all along because Agatha, now that's an evil witch, actually.
Yeah, I would have preferred if they actually had just made the main antagonist of WandaVision. If they had just kept it as Wanda's grief, I feel like would have been
Yeah.
more interesting.
I
Um,
mean, literally, in order to ensure that Agatha was considered evil and that she wasn't considered to be maybe as good as Wanda, because we really needed some contrast, they literally had Agatha kill a
I was
puppy.
about to say, it's like, just so you know that she is indeed the bad guy. She killed the dog.
Yeah.
Where the hell was John Wick?
like like that dog kind of showed up, I think basically only for that particular plot point, and maybe
Probably.
yeah, and maybe just like a little bit of banter for the kids that are growing up way too fast.
I was gonna make another point with another Marvel film, Civil War, where they were painting the Avengers to look like sort of villains because, like, oh, you knock over a couple buildings sometimes. It's like, never mind the fact that you've saved Earth from like alien invasions and all that shit. No, you're bad.
I mean, I can kind of see what they were going for with Civil War because they weren't necessarily saying that all the superheroes were evil for doing those things, but rather they just needed more supervision because right now a lot of collateral damage was kind of getting in the way. That does feel realistic to some extent, but um, then the point could be argued, and this was kind of the point that Steve was making, that like if you had to report to a higher authority, a man-made authority all the time in order to do heroic stuff, then you're not going to be able to act in the moment and actually do the heroic stuff. Instead, you're going to wait too long and something bad's going to happen when you could have stopped it. And so having this like extra verification step essentially is like unnecessary and could cause more problems than it helps. So I can kind of see both, and I think that was kind of the point. But at the same time, it did ultimately feel a little convoluted trying to like edge between the lines of like what is right and wrong. And because it's Marvel, they edged a little too far on the right side where like they had a battle in that airport and it was supposed to be this really big battle, but watching it, you knew no one was going to get hurt. You knew that no one was going to die. And I feel like they tried to make you think that maybe someone actually would, because Iron Man was pretty pissed at one point. Vision accidentally almost killed War Machine, but that was an accident, and War Machine didn't actually die. And it's like, you guys could have had some sort of lasting impact with this. Someone could have actually died. It could have been more real, but because it's Marvel, and I will praise Marvel because there are genuinely pretty good movies sometimes, but they also play it too safe sometimes, and they'll just be like, "Oh, this character isn't actually dead. Oh, this thing happened." It's, I guess, the same problem I have with comics in general, where if a character is popular in a comic, they cannot die. If they do die, they don't actually die.
Well, Endgame taught us that certain characters are apparently dead, but uh, t-
I really want to say that Endgame and Infinity War were consistent with their attempts to say that people actually died and other people didn't actually die, because I thought that the code that we were getting was if you got snapped, you were probably going to come back. If you died by any other normal means, that's just death. Death is death. But then I think that it wasn't with most characters that actually died. It was only with a select few characters. As a matter of fact, I can only think of one example off the top of my head, but they just couldn't stop themselves from managing to weasel Loki back to life after Thanos like strangled him to death.
Well,
And I know that, and I know he has a history of that, but it felt very final in Infinity War, and then in Endgame with the time travel shenanigans, and he got the Tesseract, and now there's a TV show. I just wish that they had let him die, because I feel like he had a pretty good death, and that was like the unwritten rule in Infinity War was if you died by a means that was not snapping, you were actually dead, because that's how it happened with everyone else. But Loki is always the exception when it comes to dying because he cannot die.
Loki makes a lot of fangirls' panties drop, so they realize that they have to keep him in the franchise. And I mean, technically, it's a younger version of him that's alive, and not the. Um, I almost think of him as the more canon version that died, but technically, the younger one is, of course, canon. I don't know how to explain it other than like the older version of him is gone.
Yeah,
It's,
I know what you're saying. But this is exactly the problem I described a couple of minutes ago. It's more prevalent in the actual comic books, but if a character is popular enough, say it with me now, they cannot permanently die in any way, shape, or form.
I mean, it's like with The Walking Dead. It's like if Daryl dies, we riot. You know.
The Walking Dead is actually an interesting thing to bring up when it comes to death, because while I think that there were far too many characters that died for shock value alone, and the fact that people were dying just stopped becoming an interesting gimmick over time, and literally nobody watches The Walking Dead anymore.
Yeah.
Even though there are all those problems with The Walking Dead, the one thing I think I can say, I think because I haven't actually watched all of The Walking Dead, but the one thing I think I can say for certain is that if someone dies in the show, they actually die, which is the one thing I feel like I can respect about it.
Yeah. I mean, I originally was an avid Walking Dead fan, and I watched it all the time. I feel like it's really not much of a spoiler alert anymore, but I'll just say it just in case. But I stopped watching it after Glenn's very brutal, awful death scene. And I've heard that since then, apparently people really like Negan. He's the one that, like, bashed
like
in, like Glenn
like they
said.
like his character, or they
Yeah,
think that he's a good guy.
I think both.
What?
And I can't say a whole lot because I have not watched the show since then, so I feel like I almost don't really have the right to talk about this, but I'm just going based off of what I know. But I think maybe along the way they found ways to somehow redeem him, which I feel like for me when it comes to villains, if a villain has done something really heinous, like, they very brutally murdered someone good, such as Glenn, I just can't forgive them. I just can't.
He,
And I don't understand how they could be redeemed at that rate. I mean, maybe I'd be pleasantly surprised if I watched it, but I kind of don't think I would be.
yeah.
I was really disgusted, watching that, and I just stopped watching the show at that rate. Um, I knew, of course, that with The Walking Dead, really no characters were safe, but I just kind of had my limit at that point.
Yeah.
They crossed a line for me.
I do appreciate the whole like no characters are safe. Anyone could die at any moment. That really keeps you on your toes, but like I said, that gets old after a while. And then just on top of that, um, you really do have to be careful when you're killing off a character, because you can only get rid of the characters that are actually good so often before you have no one left that people actually care about,
Yeah.
and no one wants to watch the show anymore.
Yeah, and he's one of those beloved characters from the beginning of the show where it's kind of like, oh, great. So almost no one from the beginning of the show are hardly even here anymore. Like Rick is gone, Carl's gone. A lot of characters are just dead.
Yeah.
And it's kind of, well, actually, I'm not sure about Rick. I thought maybe I heard that he wasn't technically dead, but I honestly don't know, to be honest.
Hmm.
Um,
Funny that I literally just now, during the recording of this podcast, put two and two together. But Glenn, he died in The Walking Dead, but he was reincarnated as a superhero in Invincible,
Going back to superheroes.
which the comic book that in the Invincible TV show is based off of is by the same creators as The Walking Dead.
Really?
Yeah,
Oh, I didn't know that.
yeah. So
Explains why it's gory.
it's all kind of mixed together in a weird way. Stephen Yeun played Glenn in The Walking Dead, then he played Mark Grayson in Invincible, which was also created by the same creators.
Hmm.
And these were both shows based off of comic books.
The more you know.
Yeah, interesting. But kind of rambling on back to villains. You were talking about villains with redemptive arcs. I do feel like it's really hard to create a villain with a redemptive arc without it being very, very tropey. Because what can you honestly do with a character that you set up as a villain who did genuinely villainous things and try to go about getting them to be good characters? And I'm not saying you shouldn't try to do this, because one of my favorite things is when a genuinely bad person realizes what they did was wrong and has a good solid redemption. But I do feel like it's very hard to execute well, because there's like two or three things that most movies and books do with a redemptive villain. They just die. They just die pretty soon afterwards, so you don't have to worry about the moral dilemma of like, oh, by the way, this is the guy that killed your entire family, but he's good now.
Spoil-
Instead of having to deal with that, it's just like, it's fine.
Spoiler alert. Kylo Ren. But anyways, go on.
Yeah, pretty much him. I don't really like to acknowledge Star Wars 9 in any capacity, but anyway. Um,
I mean, I'm fine with that, but that's a whole other topic. You go
yeah.
on with your other point.
Um, but you could either kill them, or maybe they'll just kind of like leave. I feel like killing is the most often. But I feel like it's genuinely, or like, I feel like you could execute it in a way that isn't very good, where it just feels awkward. Like, it's not necessarily um, talked about much amongst the characters. Like, this guy used to be evil, but he's good now, and it's like
It's
it's like
like,
it's like there should be some awkward tension, but because they kind of don't want to talk about that because it'd be hard to explain, it'd be hard to make interesting. They're just kind of like they're just there. They're just there now. They're part of the group or whatever.
that's just lazy writing.
Yeah, that's just laziness.
It's like, oh, we're told that we should accept him. Okay.
Okay, so I'm not going to go into very deep details because we're getting closer to the end here. But one of the best redemptive arcs that has ever existed is Zuko from Avatar: The Last Airbender, because not only did he, like, over the course of basically the entire series, actually go through his redemptive arc with setbacks realistically and breakthrough moments that you would expect, but also when he actually did turn good, they didn't accept him immediately. They didn't like him immediately. Nobody trusted him at all, and that makes sense. And so they like actually went through the effort of like building trust over time, which is what you would really need to do if the guy who has been relentlessly pursuing you for the last 3 seasons suddenly is like, "Hey, by the way, I'm good now." It's like, "Yeah, I don't believe you."
Yeah, I feel like it does feel more realistic in that sense, which I also appreciated. Before I forget this point, I just wanted to mention, like, I guess what I wanted to ask is, like, do you think he's, like, your favorite antagonist? Like, if you had to think of a favorite antagonist, like, what would it be? Because I think,
I mean, technically speaking, if they're redeemed, they're not the antagonist anymore.
I guess,
But he's definitely up there. I don't. It's so hard for me to list favorite things because there's a lot of things that I know that I like, but like they could technically, in certain aspects, be considered slightly different. It's like I could appreciate this villain for this reason. Like I could appreciate Thanos because I think he has understandable enough motives, and like his sheer determination is almost admirable. And then like over here on the opposite end, it's like Zuko was never really that bad, and he was always searching and trying to figure out if what he was doing was the right thing. And eventually he did find out what was the right thing for him to do. And he very, very slowly changed sides. And I thought that that was really cool. And those two characters aren't really compatible as both being villains in my mind because they're just so very on the opposite end of like a spectrum here. So it's very hard to compare, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Because I mean, like, if I had to pick a favorite antagonist, like I mentioned Eric from Phantom of the Opera earlier, so I feel like realistically he'd probably be my favorite, but he does have, a redemption arc at the end. He becomes good. So I guess if I were to not include him, then I feel like, and this is another Marvel character, I feel like if I had to pick a favorite villain, maybe it would just be Loki, and maybe because he feels like a classic villain. Like he's very, mischievous, and you can't trust him. Um,
um,
well, hang on a second. I'm not like a Loki fangirl. Like I know a lot of girls like to, uh, I guess, coddle him and be like, "Oh, he didn't do anything wrong," and it's like that's definitely not true at all. Like he's done plenty of bad things. What?
Well, like, there's arguments that have been made that, like, Loki was under the influence of, like, Thanos during Avengers. It has something to do with the Mind Stone. I don't know. It was nerd stuff. They're saying he himself was mind controlled a little bit. I don't really subscribe to that, like, mindset when it comes to him. I think that he was completely in control of his own actions, but the argument could be made. And then also, he was never really the main antagonist in almost any movie, except for maybe the first Thor. And then he was more of a surprise villain. And then at the end, his motivation was really weird, and I didn't understand it. So
Well, he was the main villain in the Avengers, like the first
that's what I'm
one.
saying. Like, if we were to, I guess, keep in mind that an argument could be made that that wasn't even his own actions
Oh, well,
in the Avengers, then that's not really him being the main antagonist in almost any movie except for maybe the first Thor. And I think Loki's interesting, but I also feel like between movies, I don't know if anybody really understood who he was because his motivations never make any sense at all to me.
I mean, yeah, and like, I'm not totally sure. As for the argument of him being, mind controlled in the Avengers, I think that's a very real, uh, possibility. I guess looking though, like backing up and looking at him, like in the first Thor movie, at first I felt bad for him, like when it was revealed that he was adopted, and you could see his very emotional reaction. Like I could feel for him there. I felt bad,
I felt
but
for him too, and then I didn't understand why that caused him to spiral into like insanity.
I guess what I was gonna say was, it was like I felt bad for him, but then later, well, I actually heard this line in the first Avengers where he was kind of accusing Thor of being tossed into the abyss, and then I felt, mad because it's like, well, that's just a blatant lie. You very clearly let go, you little drama queen.
Yeah.
And so it's like I like him as a villain, but I would definitely not be super sympathetic with him like a fangirl where it's like, oh, he's done nothing wrong, because it's like he's definitely a little liar, and I wouldn't
Yeah,
trust.
manipulative and stuff.
Yeah, like I wouldn't trust him with anything, which is kind of the whole point.
Yeah.
And I don't understand how you could ever really trust him. I did like though that in the in Infinity War, he kind of sacrificed himself, or at least he tried to make an attempt to stop Thanos, which I appreciated for sure. I felt kind of bad for him there, but
he,
I admired that you could kind of see him coming around being more of a good guy.
he kind of You give him a little medal. It's like, congratulations, you tried.
Yeah, you tried. um, so I guess basically to sum up how I feel about Loki, I like him as a villain, but I could never like trust him. Like if he were real, like here in front of us, I could never trust him with anything that he said because he's a god of mischief, and if he did manage to have a change of heart, great, but you can never truly know for sure because you never know when he would like turn and stab you in the back.
I mean, I feel like a good argument to make to that is I don't think you want your villain to be a trustworthy person, so if
No.
anything, that's good.
Well, I guess that's why I like him as a villain.
Yeah. Um, Kind of going a little bit off Loki here, because one could argue that Loki's a little cuckoo because his motivations, his aspirations, whatever, all of those are kind of hard for us mere mortals to parse because he always seems to be wanting to do something mischievous in general, and we don't know really what his ultimate goal is most of the time because he'll just betray people, and it feels like for no particular reason. But that kind of gets into a little bit one of my least favorite tropes when it comes to villains and their motivations, which is just they're crazy. It's like, okay, why are they crazy? Did they have trauma as a child? Did they, were they born with some mental illness? And for whatever reason, that kind of like spiraled into a life of crime because they were bullied or something. I don't know. You could go into reasons for why they're crazy, reasons for why that led to a life of crime and or murder or whatever. You could really make something substantial out of that. But oftentimes the reason a writer, it seems, would write a villain that is insane or crazy or something is just so that they don't have to explain why the villain's doing what they're doing. Their goals are beyond our understanding and therefore don't even try to explain it. So they can just do whatever, and it's like, oh, why did they do that? It's like, oh, because they're.
I mean, I like it with certain movies, like in Psycho or in Split. They did explain like their mental illness, or they heavily, very heavily, alluded it. Like if you look at the mental illness that those characters had, it was dissociative identity disorder, which I appreciated that that was like part of the plot. But if they don't even bother alluding to what they have, just that like, oh, who knows, they're probably just off the rocker, then
Yeah.
that's a really lame
Yeah,
excuse.
it's very lazy, it feels like. And yeah, I would say that those movies are the exception rather than the rule because the main antagonist is crazy. And, like, especially with Split, I'd say the entire movie is there to kind of explain why that is. And it actually makes a decent amount of sense why they did what they did, um, even though they are crazy. It's like, okay, now that I'm kind of in his head a little bit, I can understand that he did this for this reason. And while that doesn't make logical sense to a sane person, to an insane person, that would be like the logical thing for them to do. So, I think that the key to making a good villain is just to make them understandable in some way, because if you don't even make that attempt, then anytime the villain is on screen or something and they're doing villainous things and you're really wondering like what caused this, why are they doing this, you don't have to really question why a hero does what they do because people want to be nice and they want to help other people. That's a pretty common thing in real life. But people being evil, I mean, that's also a thing in real life, but there's always a reason for it.
Unless they're just sadistic, in which case I feel like sadistic people feel like a cliche villain to me, kind of like I'm gonna twirl my mustache and laugh evilly.
Yeah, and I guess that is a decent point. Although counterpoint, um, that wouldn't be very interesting to read.
No.
So, specifically when it comes to writing, don't be lazy and just say, oh, they're crazy. Try to, if you got a really solid villain, try to make them understandable in some way. But anyway, that's about our time. I have been Michael,
And I've been Deanna.
and this has been a Writer's Ramble. Join us next week when we talk about something else writing related. Bye.
Bye.